A very influential politician in the United States has called on Israel to use nuclear bombs in Gaza, where more than 2 million Palestinian civilians are trapped in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, including more than 1 million children. This is a clip of the U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham from the Republican Party calling live on TV for Israel to nuke Gaza.
So when we were faced with destruction as a nation after Pearl Harbor, fighting the Germans and the Japanese, we decided to end the war by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons. That was the right decision. Give Israel the bombs they need to end the war they can't afford to lose. Can I say this? Why is it okay for America to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end their existential threat war? Why was it okay for us to do that? I thought it was okay. To Israel, do whatever you have to do to survive as a Jewish state.
Senator, again, military officials say
whatever
the technology has changed.
I'm going to respond to a few things there, in particular, the myth that the U.S. had to use nuclear bombs in order to end World War II. In fact, as I'll discuss in a few minutes here, the U.S. government published a report in 1946, after World War II, admitting that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, and the U.S. did not need to nuke Japan and therefore kill 200,000 civilians in order to end the war. In reality, the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the first act of the Cold War. It was the U.S. threatening the Soviet Union. But before I get to that point, I want to mention that it's not just Lindsey Graham who has made this outrageous call to nuke Gaza. In fact, back in November, a minister in the Israeli government said the exact same thing. He said that Israel should drop nuclear bombs on Gaza. I'm reading a report here from the major Israeli newspaper, The Times of Israel. It notes that Israel's heritage minister, Amichai Eliyahu, proposed dropping nuclear bombs on Gaza Strip. And in the same interview, he said, quote, "There is no such thing as uninvolved civilians in Gaza." So he's saying that the 1 million children in Gaza are not civilians and justifying nuking them. He also called for ethnically cleansing the 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza, saying, quote, "They can go to Ireland or deserts. The monsters in Gaza should find a solution by themselves." So he's dehumanizing the 2 million civilians in Gaza as monsters. He said, again, this is a top Israeli official, he said, the northern Gaza Strip has no right to exist. And he said that anyone waving a Palestinian flag, quote, "should not continue living on the face of the earth." And by the way, this was not just a one-time throwaway comment from this top Israeli official. In January, he repeated his insistence that Israel should drop nuclear bombs on Gaza. This is a report from the Times of Israel newspaper. It notes that Israel's heritage minister, Amichai Eliyahu, suggested that Israel should drop nuclear bombs on Gaza. And he said, quote, "They know my position. Even in The Hague, they know my position." So he's basically taunting The Hague and saying, yeah, you should try me for calling for the G crime against the Palestinian people, eliminating them. Comments like these from top Israeli officials show why the International Court of Justice, the top UN legal authority, ruled back in January that Israel can be investigating for violating the Convention on the G crime, the worst possible crime a country could commit, the G crime. And Amnesty International, the mainstream human rights organization, has publicly said that Israel is violating this order given by the International Court of Justice. So Israel is engaged in the G crime to eliminate the Palestinian people. And in March, the top United Nations expert on Palestinian human rights published a report detailing how Israel is committing the G crime against the Palestinian people. And of course, it has the full backing of the US government. These are the far-right extremists who run the Israeli regime, and they are fully backed by the United States, 100% backed by the US empire. And in Washington, support for Israel is bipartisan, as we can see from the fact that Lindsey Graham is a Republican, and he has been an ally of Donald Trump. The Republicans and Trump and his supporters have been staunchly supporting Israel. And of course, the current US government is ruled by the Democrats. And Joe Biden is also arming Israel and wholeheartedly supporting Israel as it carries out these crimes against humanity. Now, I should point out that Israel is the only country in West Asia, the so-called Middle East, that has nuclear weapons. And publicly, Israel has refused to admit this, but everyone knows it. It's an open secret. Experts estimate that Israel has at least 80 nuclear weapons. And as the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute pointed out, back in 2014, the United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly approved a resolution on nuclear proliferation risks in the Middle East that urged Israel to renounce the possession of nuclear weapons, accede to the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. Israel is not party to that. And the UN General Assembly called on Israel to place all of its nuclear facilities under the International Atomic Energy Agency's comprehensive safeguards, the IAEA. Israel has refused to do all of that, violating the will of the vast majority of the international community. And of course, it's the United States that protects Israel at the United Nations, using its veto power to prevent any legal consequences to Israel for violating international law for decades. And while the Israeli regime has not publicly admitted to having nuclear weapons, of course, we see top Israeli ministers proposing using nuclear weapons in Gaza. So that's a clear admission that they know they have nuclear weapons. And in fact, there was evidence published back in 2010 showing that in the 1970s, the Israeli regime actually offered to give nuclear weapons to the South African apartheid regime. And of course, the South African apartheid regime and the Israeli apartheid regime were very close allies. And many of the apartheid tactics that were used against the black population in South Africa has also been used in Israel against the indigenous Palestinian population. I'm reading here from an article that was published in the major British newspaper, The Guardian, back in 2010, titled, "Revealed How Israel Offered to Sell South Africa Nuclear Weapons." This report reveals that in 1975, the South African defense minister asked for nuclear weapons from Shimon Peres, who was Israel's defense minister, and then he later became Israel's president. And Shimon Peres offered the South African apartheid regime 3 different sizes of nuclear weapons. And also in that meeting, they signed a comprehensive military pact. And this was revealed by a US researcher for a book on the close relationship between Israel and apartheid South Africa. And his book is titled The Unspoken Alliance, Israel's Secret Alliance with Apartheid South Africa. And this meeting was on the 31st of March in 1975. And at the talks, Israeli officials, quote, formally offered to sell South Africa some of the nuclear-capable Jericho missiles in its arsenal. So here we see the myth, one, that Israel is a so-called democracy. It is not a democracy. It is a settler colonialist apartheid regime that has been allied for decades with other colonialist apartheid regimes like in South Africa. And 2, we see that Israel has been willing to give its nuclear weapons to some of the worst human rights violators on earth. Now, finally, before I conclude, I want to respond to one other thing that the US Senator Lindsey Graham said in those outrageous comments at the beginning calling to nuke Gaza. He claimed that the US had to nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that it was an existential conflict. But in reality, as I noted in a previous video, which I will link to in the description below, it was not necessary for the US to nuke Japan. This was admitted in 1946 in a report that was published by the US government. Now, after World War II, the US government published a report titled the Strategic Bombing Survey that analyzed the effects of U.S. airstrikes in World War II. And this was conducted by the U.S. Department of War, which was the name for what we now call the Department of Defense. It later rebranded. In 1946, the Department of War published this strategic bombing survey, and it stated, quote, "Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped." I'm going to read a longer quote from this U.S. government report. Quote, "It seems clear that even without the atomic bombing attacks, air supremacy over Japan could have exerted sufficient pressure to bring about unconditional surrender and obviate the need for invasion. Based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that certainly prior to the 31st of December of 1945, and in all probability prior to the 1st of November of 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated." And as I explain in that video and article, which I will link to in the description below, in reality, the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 was the first act of the Cold War, the so-called Cold War. It obviously was not very cold for the 200,000 Japanese civilians who were killed in these attacks, and then many more who died later because of the radiation effects. And it certainly was not cold for the millions of people who died in the other wars, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the people who died in Indonesia, and the US-backed dictatorships in Chile and Brazil and Pakistan and all around the world. For them, it certainly was not a so-called Cold War. It was very hot. But in reality, the US nuclear attack on Japan was a threat to the Soviet Union because in August, the Soviet Union was also preparing its invasion of Japan to liberate Japan from the fascist regime. And the US was essentially telling the Soviet Union, you will not liberate Japan, because the US knew that if the Soviet Union liberated Japan from fascism, then it was almost certain that Japan would have a socialist government after World War II that would be allied with the Soviet Union, like many of the socialist governments in Eastern Europe that were allied with the Soviet Union. So instead, the US used nuclear bombs on Japan, killed over 200,000 civilians, and then the US military occupied Japan, and the US still today, in 2024, is militarily occupying Japan. Japan has not had a sovereign government since. The US created the post-war government in Japan, and since the 1950s, Japan has basically been a one-party state ruled by a right-wing US-backed party that was created by the CIA, the so-called Liberal Democratic Party. So all of this was the product of the US government decision to nuke Japan, to deny Japan its sovereignty, to prevent it from going socialist, and basically to turn Japan into a semi-colony of the US. And that's the situation we're in today. Of course, that's not directly related to the issue of Gaza and the G crime that Israel is committing with full US support. But of course, it is related to this ridiculous nonsense that we see from US politicians like Lindsey Graham, who are calling to now nuke Gaza. And it shows how many of the people running the US government, they are war criminals and they support the crime of G that I'm not going to mention because, again, this will be censored in the algorithm. Anytime I do mention that word, it gets censored. They are supporting these G crimes against humanity, against the Palestinian people, and they are supporting colonialism just as they supported colonialism in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and still today in the 21st century. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this, and I will see you all next time.